Well, you just watched me cutting up some MDF to make the rough blanks for all the ribs and parts of the bending forms. Here's one example. It's a rib for the side of the altar. And then you watched me start to make a jig that is going to hold these rib pieces in place while I cut the contour of them. Now, this is just simply a tracing of the paper form that I made using my CAD. And so I put a couple of cleats on here and a couple of clamps to hold the form in place. Okay, and then turning this over, I've traced the outline of the cut that I have to make using the bandsaw, and I'll cut that a little bit proud, because then I'll come back to the router table and using a straight bit with a bearing, the bearing will ride on the jig contour, and the bit will cut just that last 1/8 inch or so of material off, so that I have a rib then that is identical to the shape of the jig. And I'll just go ahead and cut all the ribs the same, and that way they're all identical. Putting these forms together is a real challenge. I've already done one form. You can see over here it's for the pulpit, and you can see on this it's kind of heavy, but I've got the 2 layers of 3/16 inch plywood and then the 1 layer of 1/8 inch hardboard bent over the ribs, all glued together to give me the curve that we want for the pulpit sides. Now, to make this really strong, I am using, for the side of the altar form, ribs that are about 1 5/8 inches apart. So there'll be quite a few ribs in here. And on the side, two layers of ribs, I put these vertical support pieces in here, and as such, to prevent the sides from imploding once we get a lot of pressure on this. These forms, this particular form is 2 feet by almost 3 feet, so you're talking about 816 square inches on this bottom, and probably a little more on the top because it's curved. And I pull about a 25-inch vacuum inside a vacuum bag. That's inches of mercury, which works out to about 12.5 psi. So if I take that 816 and multiply that by 12.5 psi, you're talking about over 10,000 pounds of pressure pushing down and pushing up from the bottom. So these ribs have to endure that kind of compressive force. And on the sides, it's less force, but it's still a lot. So the trick is to get these assembled and glued up so it's strong. Because of the shape of this thing, it's really hard to glue with like clamps or anything, so I use the vacuum bag. The idea is to get these ribs all coated with glue and in place, and then put this whole thing into the vacuum bag, and you got to work pretty fast. So I'm using Titebond 3, which gives me assembly time, closed assembly time, like 20 to 25 minutes. If I do a little prep work by assembling just this outer frame using brads from my brad gun, assemble them. It doesn't give me the greatest glue joint, but at least it gives me some firmness where I can then start placing the inner ribs and these little vertical supports on the first 2 layers in there. And then I take my pre-cut plywood, and this stuff, doesn't want to bend around this curve too easily. So I'll have to glue the 3 layers together and then tack them down and get them into the vacuum bag, so the vacuum bag force will push these down and glue all to the ribs. So it's kind of a job. I won't be talking during this process. I'll just let you watch parts of this, the parts where I'm not pulling my hair out.
Once a week with AT40, and you know where your favorite records are in the national music scene. My name's Here's the Little River Band from Australia with their 4th top 40 hit. And number 15, their song is
Well, the final step in preparing the bending form for use is to put a surface on here that glue won't stick to. When you do a bent lamination or veneering, there's always squeeze out of the glue, and it can squeeze out the edges, or sometimes on the veneer it can actually squeeze through the veneer some. You don't want it sticking to this form surface. So I use packing tape. Got a lot of it. It's easy to use. Takes a little while, but I just try to be accurate as I can and lay the tape on here, usually with a little bit of overlap between layers. And have it cover down the edge a little bit, because when the glue does squeeze out, it'll tend to move down the edge some. I'm sure there's other ways to do this. This is just what works well for me. Let me just put one last piece on the edge here, fold it over. There we go. So nothing's going to stick, and we're ready to go ahead and use this.